April 1, 2003, a strange album arrives in record stores across America and the United Kingdom. The cover shows two people sitting on opposite ends of a circus trunk, a man in a crimson suit holding a cricket bat, a woman in a white dress with a forlorn expression. They're dressed like vintage vaudeville performers, frozen in a tableau that somehow contains an elephant you can't quite see. The liner notes make a bold proclamation. No computers were used during the writing, recording, mixing, or mastering of this record. The album is called Elephant. The band is The White Stripes. And everyone, from record executives to music critics, is about to be proven spectacularly wrong about what rock music can be in the 21st century. Within weeks, a hypnotic 7-note riff will invade the global consciousness. Seven Nation Army will become more than a song. It will become a sports anthem chanted in stadiums from Milan to Moscow. A cultural phenomenon so massive that many people who sing it have no idea who created it. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. The two people on that album cover were divorced. They had been for 3 years. They told the world they were brother and sister. They recorded the entire album in 2 weeks using equipment from the 1960s in a tiny London studio. They had no bass player, they had no computers, they had no safety net. And they created one of the greatest rock albums of all time. This is the story of how Jack and Meg White broke every rule, defied every expectation, and proved that sometimes genius comes from what you leave out, not what you add in. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is the White Stripes' Elephant. To understand Elephant, you have to understand the most audacious myth in modern rock history. September 21st, 1996. John Anthony Gillis marries Megan Martha White in a Detroit ceremony. He takes her last name, becoming Jack White. 1 year later, they form a band, the White Stripes, red, white, and black. Peppermint candy stripes on Meg's drum kit. Jack's plastic guitars, simple, raw, primal. But from the very beginning, they tell everyone they're siblings, brother and sister. Jack introduces Meg on stage as my big sister Meg White. It's a lie, a deliberate, carefully constructed lie that becomes central to their mythology. Jack White would later explain the reasoning to Rolling Stone in 2005. When you see a band that is two pieces, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, you think, oh, I see. When they're brother and sister, you go, oh, that's interesting. You care more about the music, not the relationship, whether they're trying to save their relationship by being in a band. The marriage ended in March 2000. The divorce was quiet, civilized. Most people didn't know about it. And Jack and Meg? They decided to keep playing together, keep the lie going, keep making music. By 2001, the secret was becoming harder to maintain. The White Stripes had released White Blood Cells, their breakthrough album. The Lego animated video for Fell in Love with a Girl was all over MTV. They were no longer Detroit underground darlings. They were becoming famous. On March 30th, 2001, the Detroit Free Press published their marriage certificate. The sibling story was exposed as fiction. Most bands would have imploded. Most ex-couples would have called it quits. Jack and Meg White did something different. They kept going. They kept the aesthetic. They kept the mystery. And they set out to record their most ambitious work yet. Winter 2001. Jack White had a problem. He needed to record the follow-up to White Blood Cells, an album that had made the White Stripes one of the hottest bands in the garage rock revival sweeping America and Britain. But Jack didn't want to record in America. He didn't want Pro Tools. He didn't want digital recording. He didn't want anything that smelled like the slick, overproduced rock that dominated the early 2000s. Jack White wanted to make a record the way they made records in 1963. He'd heard about a studio in London called Toe Rag, run by an engineer named Liam Watson, who was as obsessed with vintage equipment as Jack was. Watson had been collecting old gear since the early 1990s, a time when studios were literally giving away analog equipment because everyone wanted digital. Toe Rag Studios was located in a nondescript building on Glyn Road in Hackney, a working-class neighborhood in East London. Inside was a time capsule, an 8-track Studer A80 tape machine, a vintage EMI Red 17 mixing console originally from Abbey Road Studios, and absolutely nothing manufactured after 1963. No computers, no digital, no safety. Watson's philosophy was simple. I'm interested in how a record was made in 1965 in London. Rubber Soul was recorded on a 4-track, and to me it sounded better than the latest record by whoever. Jack White had found his temple. The White Stripes' connection to Toe Rag came through Watson's own band. When Watson's group supported the White Stripes on their first UK tour, Jack White approached him at the 100 Club in London, excited about the studio. They came for a visit, spent an evening recording, and Jack knew immediately this was where Elephant needed to be born. April 2002. Jack and Meg White arrived in London and checked into accommodations in the Angel neighborhood. They had booked 2 weeks at Torag Studios, 2 weeks to record an entire album. For context, most major label albums in 2002 took months. Multiple studios, teams of engineers, Pro Tools sessions with hundreds of tracks. The Stripes were going to record 14 songs to 8-track tape in 14 days. Liam Watson remembers Jack's work ethic from those sessions. Jack would write and change lyrics in the studio. We got along well throughout. The recording setup was deliberately primitive. Watson describes his approach. You're working on a performance. If you do have a real great performance and there's one bum note, it's like, that's really great, it's taken us hours. Let's see if we can just patch in this bit. You can do a little bit of that. But if you cannot do that, it's much better. You're looking for performances. This wasn't modern recording where you could fix everything in post-production. This was capturing live moments, getting it right or doing it again. The pressure was enormous. Meg's drum setup was a Ludwig Classic Maple kit, the same type used on countless classic rock records. Watson mic'd most of her drumming onto one track, with the bass drum separately mixed to its own track. This gave Meg's kick drum that driving front and center presence that defines so many Elephant tracks. For guitar tones, Jack used vintage Selmer and Vox amplifiers available at the studio. He recorded double guitar lines when needed, one rhythm, one lead, separately onto the 8-track machine, creating the illusion of a much bigger sound. The aesthetic was crucial. As Jack told Sound on Sound magazine, "There's no digital stuff at Torag Studios, not even Pro Tools. I realize my studio only appeals to a certain type of musician. We only used one piece of outboard gear for the entire Elephant album, and that was a Uri 1176 compressor for one vocal track. One compressor, for an entire album." The sessions moved fast. Watson had worked with enough garage rock bands to know how to capture raw energy. Some tracks came together in a few takes, others required more work, but the philosophy remained. If it sounds good, it is good. January 29, 2002, 3 months before the Torag sessions, Jack White was sound-checking at the Corner Hotel in Melbourne, Australia, during the White Stripes tour. He started playing around with a simple 7-note riff. It was hypnotic, repetitive, primitive, almost childlike in its simplicity. Ben Swank, who worked with Jack and would later become an executive at Jack's Third Man Records label, was walking by. Jack called him over. "Swank, check this riff out." Swank's response? "It's okay." That was it. "It's okay." Jack filed the riff away. He'd been thinking of it as a possible James Bond theme. He was obsessed with Bond films and dreamed of writing a theme song. But that seemed unlikely to happen. What Jack didn't know was that 5 years later, he actually would write a Bond theme. Another Way to Die, with Alicia Keys for Quantum of Solace. But in 2002, he figured he should use this riff for something else. He didn't have lyrics yet. He just called it Seven Nation Army, a childhood mispronunciation of the Salvation Army that Jack remembered from when he was young. It was just a working title, a way to remember which riff he was talking about. The song was an experiment. Jack wanted to write a song without a chorus, just verses and that riff. As he told Guitar World, "It was me trying to write a song without a chorus and still get people's attention. I thought it was just a little experiment that not many people would care about. It was just a challenge to myself. I'm not gonna have a chorus in this song. See if I can get away with it." The famous bass line isn't actually a bass. The White Stripes didn't have a bass player. That was central to their aesthetic. Instead, Jack played his 1950s K hollow body guitar through a Digitech whammy pedal set to drop the pitch down 1 octave, creating that massive, earth-shaking low-end sound. Tuned to open A, the riff consisted of just 5 notes, pitched close together, simple enough that anyone could hum it, whistle it, or, as the world would soon discover, chant it in massive crowds. The lyrics came later, and they were deeply personal. This was Jack processing the gossip and scrutiny that came with the White Stripes' sudden fame, the revelation of their marriage and divorce, the constant questions about their relationship. "I'm going to Wichita, far from this opera forevermore," he sang. A 7-nation army couldn't hold me back. It was a song about wanting to escape, about gossip, about feeling cornered by fame. Neither the American nor British record labels wanted it as the first single. Label executives didn't hear a hit. Too long, no chorus, too weird. Jack and Meg fought for it, and on February 17, 2003, 7-Nation Army was released. While 7-Nation Army would become the most famous track, Elephant contained deep cuts that showcased just how far Jack White could push the blues rock format on an 8-track machine. Ball and Biscuit clocked in at over 7 minutes, the longest studio recording the White Stripes ever made. It was pure, sweaty, traditional 12-bar blues, with Jack channeling the spirit of Willie Dixon's The Seventh Son. The title came from a vintage STC 4031 microphone at Toe Rag Studios, nicknamed the Ball and Biscuit because of its distinctive round shape. Jack crafted lyrics shortly before recording, improvising much of the song's swagger and sexual innuendo in the moment. It became a concert showcase, a song where Jack could stretch out, solo for minutes, and demonstrate his connection to blues tradition. Bob Dylan was so impressed that on March 17, 2004, he brought Jack on stage in Detroit to perform it together. An audience recording was briefly available on the White Stripes website, capturing one of rock's great intergenerational moments. The hardest button to button was tight, angular alt-rock. The music video, directed by Michel Gondry, featured Jack and Meg leaving duplicates of themselves with every beat, creating a mesmerizing visual trail through Los Angeles streets. There's No Home for You Here was the White Stripes pushing the 8-track format to its absolute limits. Jack later said, "That song was our attempt to see how far we could go with an 8-track recorder, and I think how far we went is too far." The track built from quiet intimacy to stadium-sized grandeur, featuring a choir arranged by Jack adding emotional heft. Then there was Meg's showcase, In the Cold, Cold Night. One of the rare tracks where Meg sang lead vocals. Her voice was delicate, sweet, almost fragile, a stark contrast to Jack's raw howl. Critics described it as magnetic, and it became one of the most beloved deep cuts on the album. Not everything on Elephant was original material. Two crucial covers showed the White Stripes' range and their ability to completely reimagine existing songs. I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself was a Burt Bacharach and Hal David composition, originally a soulful ballad. In the White Stripes' hands, it became something desperate, almost violent, Meg's drums pounding relentlessly while Jack's vocals dripped with longing. It was Meg's idea to cover the song. The band had been performing it live, and it felt natural to include on the album. The recording took place at BBC's Maida Vale Studios rather than Toe Rag, capturing a slightly different sonic texture. Sofia Coppola directed the music video, featuring Kate Moss performing an interpretive dance on a bare soundstage. Shot in stark black and white, it became iconic, Moss's vulnerability and grace perfectly matching the song's emotional intensity. The song became the White Stripes' first chart entry in the Netherlands and New Zealand when released as the second single in September 2003. The other cover was the album's closer, It's True That We Love One Another, featuring British singer-songwriter Holly Golightly. Recorded in November 2001 at Toe Rag, before the main Elephant sessions, it was a gentle acoustic conversation between three voices. The song was a playful meta-commentary on the White Stripes' mythology. Golightly delivered the line, "I love Jack White like a little brother," deliberately toying with the band's sibling story even as the truth was becoming public knowledge. The album's artwork became almost as famous as its music, a puzzle that Jack White designed to reveal itself slowly over time. The photograph shows Jack and Meg in elaborate vintage costumes, positioned on opposite ends of a red circus trunk. Jack holds a cricket bat, a nod to the album being recorded in London, while Meg appears contemplative, almost sad. Their positioning and the colors create an optical illusion. In a 2007 interview with Q magazine, Jack explained, "If you study the picture carefully, Meg and I are elephant ears in a head-on elephant. But it's a side view of an elephant too, with the tusks leading off either side." He continued, "I wanted people to be staring at this album cover, and then maybe 2 years later, having stared at it for the 500th time, to say, hey, it's an elephant." The album was released with at least 6 different cover variations across different territories and formats. On some, the cricket bat touches the ground. On others, it hovers. The image is sometimes mirrored, switching Jack and Meg's positions. The 10th anniversary edition changed Meg's white dress to black, removing one of the White Stripes from the cover entirely. Critics interpreted the elephant as symbolic of the band's philosophy. Rolling Stone's David Fricke described it as representing the endangered animal's brute power and less honored instinctual memory for dead relatives, a reference to the blues and rock traditions the White Stripes were channeling. There was also a human skull visible behind Meg's knee in the photograph, adding another layer of memento mori to the image. April 4, 2003. Elephant hit stores. But there was an immediate problem. Meg had broken her wrist in March while in New York, just weeks before the album's release. All promotional touring was postponed. Despite the setback, the album was unstoppable. It debuted at #1 in the United Kingdom. In America, it peaked at number 6 on the Billboard 200 with first-week sales of 126,000 copies, massive numbers for a garage rock duo recording to 8-track tape. The critical response was rapturous. Rolling Stone's David Fricke called it a work of pulverizing perfection. NME declared, "The eloquence, barbarism, tenderness, and sweat-drenched vitality of Elephant make it the most fully realized White Stripes album yet." Pitchfork praised the album's ambition. Pop Matters said it cemented their evolution from Blind Willie McTell cover band with a pop sensibility to full-fledged, honest-to-goodness rock and roll gods. The album earned a Metacritic score of 92 out of 100, indicating universal acclaim. Even the rare negative critiques acknowledged the music's power. Newsweek's Lorraine Ali pleaded for the band to drop the enigmatic charade of the sibling story, but concluded, "Elephant still sounds great." More importantly, Seven Nation Army was becoming a phenomenon. The song peaked at number 76 on the Billboard Hot 100, the White Stripes' first entry on that chart. But that number doesn't capture its true impact. In Europe, Seven Nation Army reached the top 10 in the UK and became a fixture on rock radio worldwide. The song's structure, that riff serving as the chorus, eliminating the need for a traditional hook, was unlike anything on mainstream radio. And then something unexpected happened. Sports fans discovered it. In 2006, during a Champions League match between Club Brugge and AS Roma in Belgium, Roma fans began chanting the riff. It spread. Italian football fans adopted it during the 2006 FIFA World Cup. When Italy won the tournament, you could hear the riff being sung in the streets of Rome. The song became known in Italy as the Po 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 song. It spread to other countries, other sports. By 2010, you could hear it at football matches across Europe, at baseball games in America, at political rallies worldwide. Jack White told NPR in a 2010 interview, "I am honored that the Italians have adopted this song as their own. Nothing is more beautiful in music than when people embrace a melody and allow it to enter the pantheon of folk music." The riff had transcended its creators. It belonged to the world now. February 8, 2004. The 46th Annual Grammy Awards at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. The White Stripes walked into the ceremony with 3 nominations: Album of the Year, Best Alternative Music Album, Best Rock Song, Seven Nation Army. They were competing against some of the biggest names in music. For Album of the Year, they were up against Outkast's Speakerboxx, The Love Below, which would ultimately win. But the White Stripes didn't leave empty-handed. They won Best Alternative Music Album for Elephant, their first Grammy Award. Seven Nation Army won Best Rock Song. 2 golden gramophones for a divorced couple who recorded an album in 2 weeks with no computers. Jack White spoke to the press on the Grammy red carpet, emphasizing what the awards meant to him. They highlight all different types of music. All across the board, everybody gets involved. I think that's wonderful. The White Stripes also performed during the televised ceremony, delivering a roaring, barely controlled rendition of Seven Nation Army that reminded viewers this wasn't polished pop. This was raw, dangerous rock and roll. The album continued its commercial ascent. By September 2003, Elephant was certified platinum in the United States. In the UK, it achieved double platinum certification by October 2003. The album would eventually sell over 4 million copies worldwide, the White Stripes' best-selling record. Elephant finished 2003 as number 57 on the Billboard 200 year-end chart and spent 58 weeks on the chart overall, the longest run of any White Stripes album. In December 2003, NME named Elephant their Album of the Year. Rolling Stone initially ranked it number 390 on their 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list in 2003, but later called it the 5th best album of the entire decade. The album's influence rippled outward. Every rock band that emerged in the mid to late 2000s had to acknowledge what the White Stripes had proven. You didn't need elaborate production. You didn't need computers. You didn't need a bass player. You needed songs. You needed soul. You needed the courage to strip everything down to its essence. The Arctic Monkeys cited the White Stripes as an influence. The Black Keys built their early career on a similar 2-piece blues rock template. Modern garage rock revivalists from around the world pointed to Elephant as the album that showed it could be done. Jack White himself would go on to multiple other projects, The Raconteurs, The Dead Weather, and a successful solo career. He founded Third Man Records, continuing his mission to preserve analog recording traditions while pushing creative boundaries. Meg White retired from public life after the White Stripes disbanded in 2011. She lives in Detroit, away from the spotlight, her legacy secure as one of rock's most distinctive and minimalist drummers. In a 2014 Rolling Stone interview, Jack spoke warmly of what Meg brought to the band. She was the antithesis of a modern drummer, so childlike and incredible and inspiring. All the not talking didn't matter because, on stage, nothing I do will top that. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame will induct the White Stripes in 2025. writing in their announcement, "The White Stripes reimagined minimalist garage and punk rock for a new generation and brought blues into the 21st century. They proved that a band could create massive, genre-defining sound with only 2 people, inspiring a wave of rock and roll revivalists and making a lasting mark on popular music. But there's a complexity to Elephant's story that deserves acknowledgement. While Jack White produced the album and served as primary songwriter, the record's creation involved more collaboration than the credits sometimes suggest. Liam Watson engineered and mixed the album, contributing crucial sonic decisions. The vintage equipment at Toe Rag, Watson's carefully curated collection, was essential to the sound. Some critics and musicians have pointed out that garage rock revival wasn't created by the White Stripes alone. They emerged from Detroit's active underground scene alongside bands like the Von Bondis, the Dirt Bombs, and the Detroit Cobras. The Strokes' Is This It in 2001 helped pave the commercial path. International acts like the Hives and the Vines were part of the same moment. Jack White's genius was in synthesis, taking blues traditions, punk energy, and pop songcraft, then filtering it all through a radically minimalist aesthetic. But genius is always built on foundations others laid. There's also the question of how the sibling myth affected Meg White. While Jack embraced showmanship and later discussed the fabrication openly, Meg, who has always been intensely private and struggles with anxiety, had to live with being part of that manufactured narrative. In interviews, Meg rarely spoke. "The more you talk, the less people listen," she told Rolling Stone in 2005. That reticence was sometimes misinterpreted as Meg being merely along for the ride, rather than being an essential creative partner whose drumming style was as crucial to the White Stripes' sound as Jack's guitar. Elephant represented a moment when rock music remembered its past to build its future. In an era of nu metal, pop-punk, and increasingly digital production, the White Stripes made an album that sounded like it could have been recorded in 1965, and somehow that made it feel urgently contemporary. The divorced couple who pretended to be siblings. The 8-track tape machine in a London studio. The rejection of computers and modern production techniques. The 7-note riff that became a global anthem. All of it added up to something that felt both ancient and brand new. Liam Watson, the engineer who captured it all to tape, reflected, "Jack and Meg had a chemistry that was undeniable. The way they worked together in the studio, there was an understanding there that went beyond words." 22 years later, 7 Nation Army plays at every major sporting event on Earth. Elephant appears on every credible best albums of the 2000s list. The White Stripes influenced a generation of musicians who learned that limitation can be liberation. And somewhere in Detroit, Meg White lives a quiet life, having left behind one of rock's most distinctive legacies. Jack White continues making music, running Third Man Records, and championing analog recording. He's never tried to recreate Elephant. He doesn't need to. That moment is captured forever on those reels of tape. 2 people, no bass, 1 legendary riff. 14 songs, 2 weeks, 8 tracks. Sometimes the biggest sound comes from the smallest setup. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and Elephant's story proved that in rock and roll, less really can be more.